Well, thanks for being here. It's really wonderful. It's nice to also revisit the exhibition and have a chance to talk to somebody who actually knows what's going on. Because as an artist, I think what's interesting is a lot of my work deals with anecdotal kind of observations about issues of counterfeiting, copyright, and authorship. But to actually have a chance to dialogue with someone who can either correct me or augment my ideas, I think is going to be really wonderful. Right now, as Jamie was saying, you're sitting in the installation called Free Texts, an open source reading room, and usually the bookshelves are out in the center space, and there's a kind of reading area that's set up with tables and chairs. But what you see here in the back is kind of the main focus, which is this flyer wall. And the flyers are all made from texts that have been uploaded mostly illicitly by various file sharers around the world. And so I've created these kinds of physical flyers where people can tear off the tabs underneath it. And if you type in the URL at home, you'll get a copy of that text downloaded to your hard drive. So as Jamie mentioned, it's kind of like an analog version of file sharing. And behind this shelf over here is actually a work desk where I produce the I download and I print out the books and then bind them and then have them also available for readers on the shelves. So I've been running this project now for, I guess, the last 2-3 months in September, and at times I sit at the desk and I try to engage viewers with how they perceive this work, what it means to be a copyright breaker, because essentially, as a visitor, if you're tearing off these tabs, you are participating in technically an illegal act. But obviously, because of the way most folks are going about sharing information online these days, it's very, it's kind of questionable as to if people think that there's actually anything wrong with it anymore. So again, this kind of ties in with my interests of issues of ownership, authorship, and kind of just reflecting, not necessarily saying if these are good or bad things that are happening, but really just trying to bring to the surface activities that are already existing. So I think with that, I will turn it over to Mike to talk about his interests.
Okay, well, before I talk about my interests, I guess I want to start making recommendations of books on this wall. I suspect the book most likely to have been read maybe is The Gift. How many people have read that? A few people. Well, one of the recommendations of The Gift, or descriptions perhaps, is that in gift cultures, something essential to a gift is that it be circulated. If you just give a gift and it's just taken, essentially, it sort of loses its gift nature. And so I wanted to actually practice that tonight. And I was at a conversation kind of like this about a year ago at this space between a technologist and an artist. And one thing that stuck with me from that conversation is a discussion about artists in residence within institutions, a business, for example, where the artist isn't just off making some art to decorate the walls, but is actually part of it made an integral part of the teams at the business where they're in residence, and that's something that kind of stuck with me from that event. I've been thinking about, especially since I'm no longer working full-time for Creative Commons, and thinking about next organizations and stuff like that. So I wanted to pass along that from this previous event, and I hope that a year from now, some of you will remember something from this discussion, and you can pass it along in 2 years. So about me, I've always been interested in kind of economics and computers, and have strong tastes in culture, I suppose. And intellectual property kind of issues are a nice union of all of those things. my background is studying economics. I first encountered intellectual property through trade-related intellectual property treaties, which there's a book about that I have not read up here. Well, if you look, TRIPS is kind of the acronym for it. And as an economics student, I thought property is generally a good way to allocate resources efficiently, but the way TRIPS, when I read about TRIPS, which are kind of agreements by which, I guess the pejorative way to put it is that the United States primarily forces other countries to ratchet up their IP regimes. I realized that it's not, something was amiss about this particular kind of property. And as the free software movement started and people were sharing stuff on the internet, I became very excited to participate in that sort of thing because I knew that there was a problem with the regime and it was actually changing in a way. Even if the law wasn't changing yet, people were collaborating as if it had changed. So I was a co-founder of a startup called Bitsy that actually bears some relationship to this kind of thing because it's allowed you to take an identifier, which you can think of as a pull tab. In fact, we called them tickets, and you could use that identifier to collaborate around a file. For example, say that this is the best version of a file, or it has a virus or whatever, without having any other vector of communication between two people. And then I've been working at Creative Commons for about 9 years, and of course if you're not familiar with Creative Commons or free software and open source, the general idea is that we provide tools called public copyright licenses that you can apply to your work that explicitly grant some permissions up front for other people to use the work under some conditions. And this is actually quite different from the work that people like Stephanie do, I guess, in the kind of pure art world, where open source is a very informal thing. In the space that I'm in and in the open source software world, it's very, very much about formalities. It's very much about having all of the rights cleared so that other people, even if they're in a big company that has a lot of liability, can use work that you've shared. So with that, I want to first say that it's okay to interrupt us with questions throughout the event. And I want to start off by asking Stephanie a question, which is open-ended. Stephanie, I'd like to know what your thoughts are about the future of culture to contextualize this. And let me explain why really briefly. Usually, I've been at many discussions about the future of intellectual property and culture, and usually they're sort of mushed together immediately, and people are thinking, nobody's ever going to make a movie again, or all communications are going to be outlawed. And really, I think that we need to disentangle those a little bit, and let's talk about a vision for the future of culture before we even get to the legal stuff.
All right, the future of culture. Well, I think beyond policy, so again, and this ties back to my interests of why I wanted to do this project, was no matter what gets legislated, people have a tendency to create systems that they are then kind of actively participating in. So in a way, it's like, depending on how you pose that question, the future of culture in terms of policy or law versus how it's actually used on the ground. And I mean, what I think most people suspect is that it's just going to get messier and messier. And that's a term that you were using earlier too. And in the sense that it's like I've been wondering today, I'm almost 40, but what is it like for a college student today who is sharing things, and breaking copyright left and right, but not necessarily thinking there are any consequences to it. Right. And so as that moves forward generationally, how is that still going to become translated or distilled in different ways. So I have a pretty hopeful vision that no matter how regimented things will become, that either folks will find their own way around it, like get a workaround. But then the other weird thing is, so I don't know, does anyone here listen to Spotify? Yes. All right. So I don't have the paid version, but the free version, they put these ads on all the time. Have you noticed it? It says copyright is so old-fashioned. Or no, piracy. Piracy is so old-fashioned. Why don't you, listen to Spotify because we pay the rights holders? So it's kind of funny that to beat the issue of music piracy, Spotify has now given you free music, but they've been able to package it in such a way that it's now the next alternative, even though it's still an advertising-based structure. So I think there's going to be this interesting wily dance between creative legal teams and how the public pursues what they want. Right.
Well, you've completely fallen into the trap that everybody falls into. Talking about, rather than stepping back and thinking about the future of culture for a moment, you're immediately grappling with what legal battles are going to happen. But before we go on, we had a question here.
Go on.
Okay.
This being an opportune time for us.
Okay, great. So maybe I can talk about the future of culture for just a second. But first I want to ask, how many people here think that there's a greater than 25% chance that society is going to collapse in some fashion, whether it's because of plagues or financial crises or war, or what, say within the next 30 years?
3 years?
30.
Oh, 30.
Next generation, essentially. Only one person? Okay, I'm actually surprised. Okay, well, that's a longer discussion. That's a longer discussion.
But rupture, some giant rupture.
Yes, it could be the rapture as well. But,
rupture.
Rupture, yes. But, okay, I didn't want to get totally sidetracked on that. But one other question: how many people think that there's a greater than, or 1/3 or greater chance that we'll have some kind of technological singularity where, whether it's soft, like we transition from agriculture to industry, to things doubling every couple of years, to some hard takeoff sort of thing. Any of those scenarios, 1/3 or greater chance of any of those things happening. Nobody. So, okay, the glorious future will arrive during our lifetimes. 1/3 or greater chance.
15%?
Okay. Okay. Well, no, it didn't work then. I thought that you'd have a sizable number of people who thought that doom and gloom were coming very soon, or the glorious future were coming very soon, and some people might raise their hands both times. So it didn't work out exactly as I planned. But why did I ask that? It's because the future of culture is going to be really deeply influenced, if you will, by how the surrounding society and economy and everything else plays out. Go.
I would actually add to that, the thing is, our culture is also going to affect the chances for these zombie apocalypse
Of course.
and singularity as well.
Yes.
Because it is you can't separate everything else from the culture. The culture
Right.
is the direction system.
Yes, that's. I was going to get to that one. Let me get to that in really quickly. When people think about the future, I guess not you guys. Many people think about those kinds of scenarios, and so we'll probably be someplace between those, and the future of culture is but the future of culture will be shaped largely by those kinds of forces. In other words, technological change and economics. in a much deeper way, no matter what the legal regime is around it. And it's going to be crazily diverse. It's going to be, the expectations of performers will keep on going up, but at the same time, access to tools of creation will keep on, allowing more people to create. And it's that kind of, and even if you believe in one of those extreme kinds of scenarios, the culture that we're creating, over the next 30 years are going to influence the probabilities of those scenarios and also how they might play out, because they'll play out in the culture we've been creating over the next 30 years. So I want people to, when people are thinking about these kind of legal and norm and social norm sort of issues, don't just leap into what are the legal battles going to be, but what kind of context are they going to occur in that's going to be probably, as we go further out, quite different from the context that we're in right now. But also, how can we influence that context as it develops so that it plays out in a socially good way? So that's why I asked about the future of culture. But I guess I was going to, maybe you have a question for me, because I was going to ask you about the future of IP, and you've already kind of.
Well, I guess so. In the times also that I've sat here and observed people's reactions to participating in this, in some cases, people literally come to me and say, "Can you do this? Is this legal?" And my answer to them actually is probably not, but I actually don't know. So, if this is sort of like that's just a very kind of immediate thing, about what's happening here. But in general, since these files, I didn't upload any of these files, but I still don't own the copyright. Nobody who uploaded it owns the copyright. But as a purveyor of this information, am I kind of like Pirate Bay?
Well, I wouldn't assume that nobody who uploaded it owns the copyright. I mean, sometimes copyright holders do realize that that's the Pirate Bay or Mediafire or whatever a good place to disseminate their works. So, but that's a minor footnote. I'm not a lawyer, so you shouldn't believe anything that I say. But in general, I mean, the stuff on the wall is probably not problematic at all. And if it is problematic, it means that society is going in a really bad direction. But the printed books probably are, because you're...
Really? So the printed books are bad because that's the thing.
Yes.
But conveying the way to get the thing is not bad, technically.
Well, it's not nearly as bad. I mean, some people will argue that providing the location is an inducement to infringe, for example. But in general, providing a link, at least should not be a problem. Whether it, but I won't say that you'll never get sued for it. But certainly providing, actually making a copy and distributing a copy of the copyrighted work, like many of these books, if the copyright holder wanted to, could. At the very least, tell you to stop doing that.
I have a question or a comment. I'm sorry? No, but it seems that the issues of copyright and intellectual property are mostly based on the value that somebody's getting from whatever you are violating. And if you're doing nothing to make money on behalf of somebody else's work, who cares?
But you're taking money away,
no,
maybe.
But if you were now, all of a sudden, for whatever reason, making millions of dollars by providing this, somebody might come after you. But unless you do, it seems that nobody cares, and whether it's legal or not is irrelevant.
I think going all the way back to Napster, you could take exception to that perception.
It's a
It
delusion.
doesn't really matter if you're making money off it or not. It's profits.
Yeah.
If you give it away for free, in theory, I'm not defending the legal octopus that we're dealing with, but in theory, every free giveaway of something someone can make money for is taking away a potential sale.
But does it matter that Stephanie's not giving any of this away?
Well, that's why she does the art to make us copyright.
Well, I mean, one thing that's interesting, so we were discussing earlier that right now, legally, I became interested in Is that me? Oh, hi. Am I still here? Okay. So, wow.
That's great.
Okay. Wait, I think it's dead now. Is it dead?
Hello?
Hi. Okay, I'll just speak loudly. I think my mic just died. Oh, okay, I can do that. So I guess Hello? Oh, so I became interested also in issues of copyright because as an artist, there's such a rich history of appropriation in terms of how, you know, historically artists have built upon what's already been made. So both visually, idea-wise, et cetera. It's become kind of accepted within the art world. And then also looking for examples in the real world of, you know, how that can also... Ooh. You know, I'll just talk loudly.
You need to get rid of
The old mic may be
get rid of
causing
this
trouble.
one. Okay.
That's what's
Is that
turning this
better?
into dub stuff.
It's sound art.
I know. You know, it's okay. I can talk above it. So I guess, you know, in thinking about how it's more, I don't want to say it's accepted to break copyright in the art world, but it's definitely a kind of, you know, train of thought that somehow has been absorbed in a way. But then out in the real world, you know, to add or modify onto something that's existing, and then, you know, create your own thing out of it is sometimes questionable. Like YouTube videos have run into that problem where people are remixing copyrighted, you know, movies or other videos.
Not a lot of commercial interest in a work, then it doesn't make any sense for there to be a legal apparatus around that will prevent people from using that work. But because copyright automatically applies to everything upon fixation, you kind of have an inefficient over allocation of property rights, if you will. That everything is restricted automatically, whereas you could have something that would, you know, probably be a more efficient default allocation if only things, the only things that were subject to copyright would be things that people had requested to be subject to copyright. But so that's kind of one of the standard menu items of copyright, or wishes of copyright reformers. But I don't politically, I don't think it's on the horizon anytime.
Well, another thing though, I feel like we're all talking about money, right? So it's only harmful if someone is kind of economically disadvantaged. But there is such a thing as cultural capital, which is what someone gains not monetarily, but in association with being a creative producer. So, you know, cultural capital is immaterial in the sense that it's not about dollars and cents, but it's about how your profile could be raised culturally, or how you kind of accumulate like a voice maybe within the larger culture. So, I mean, that's like a whole other issue too, because copyright also protects cultural capital, right?
I mean, protect. You can't think of it that way. I mean, there's actually another kind of tradition of copyright. There's the economic, kind of commercial rights tradition that's primarily Anglo, and then there's what's called moral rights are much stronger in continental Europe, especially, which is more about protecting the honor and reputation of the artist and not allowing mutilation of the work and that sort of thing. And both are problematic in their own way. I think, and I mean, to be honest, I don't like either approach. I think, and maybe I'll say why. I think that default restrictions on information, which is really what you can think of as copyright being, have bad effects on freedom, especially freedom of speech, and on equality, because they essentially creates a new kind of property that is the distribution of within society is very concentrated. So it's harmful. So default restrictions on information are harmful to freedom and equality, which are both very difficult things to maintain in society. So I think having an institution which is kind of by default works against freedom and equality is a really bad default for society. And changing that will require changing the way people think about the economics, and realizing that the primary business isn't in being able to restrict other people from distributing copies of your work, but also means changing our conceptions about authorship and things like that. That will hopefully in the long run make people not think necessarily that the way they build cultural capital is by not allowing other people to do anything with their work. I think that that's a place where both art that sort of exists out to some extent outside of legal arrangements has a role to play in changing discussion, but so does the formality of things like Creative Commons and open source, because you can have collaborations at institutions that are big enough that they actually require they require jumping through legal hoops, so that something like Wikipedia or some other kind of mass collaboration isn't a target that can be destroyed.
What is your vision of the future of culture? Because, I mean, what you're talking about is a fundamental shift in the way that content creators get paid as well.
I don't actually think it's that fundamental of a shift. The most content creators are not paid through selling copyright licenses. The sort of household names tend to be because they can achieve a great economy of scale from selling copies, but most creation of creative work or research, whatever, is done because it's part of some other job. All of academia is an example of that. And I mean, that's something that the taxpayers are paying for. Why shouldn't the whole world benefit from that information?
Stephanie, I think free text open source reading room from an external read on project one could certainly say that it's making a political statement about many of the issues that we're bringing to light tonight. But in my Creative Commons, I think it's also a fairly reasonable thing to say has staked out a kind of political terrain as it relates to information about copyright and information generally, in terms of ideas about how that might be shaped for content producers and others. So my question really has to do with the nature of those politics. And do you see a need to sort of reframe a kind of political culture that is maybe something akin to like the environmental movement, or where there's a kind of a more robust, shared, deeper, resonating understanding about how else to think about this going forward, as opposed to falling prey to the way it is shaping now, which, in my opinion, looks to be almost like a modernization of the process, like a much more restricting way of dealing with it, and just lots of assumptions made about how to do this, like where to seek copyrights. Maybe yes, maybe no. Or maybe I'm going to strive for an IP because I want to protect or I want to somehow monetize what I'm doing. So, I mean, there seems to be a really restricted set of notions that come with our ideas about how information works. So I'm just curious, do either of you or both of you see a need for kind of shifting a kind of politics of information?
I think that would be great. That would be awesome. But I also agree with you. Like, I don't think that's actually from a policy level. I mean, it would be radical, right, if things started opening up a little bit more. But the amazing thing, though, is that I don't actually think policy has to affect what users decide to do either. You know, so it's like, I mean, some of the most inspiring, or like just observing how, say, in the developing world, like in the Philippines, where my family is from, nobody cares, you know, about what and why, because they have so limited access to purchase things, you know, at the retail price, that everything is just rampantly copied and pirated. And that's because they want to also take part in a larger kind of global discussion, you know, of popular culture and, you know, music and information. So that doesn't, I mean, it doesn't matter what the US policy people do. You know, that's just such a minor part of it. Like, it's unenforceable in a lot of other areas, unless, of course, though, now more treaties or more international treaties are starting to happen too, like with, or not even treaties, but threats. So like with China, say, right, in the US.
Oh, there's definitely treaties as well. I mean, most free trade agreements these days include mandates to restrict IP further.
But do you think that it's closing? So you just see it closing down more and more. Or is there going to be like some radical opening?
Well, I think sort of the formal things are closing more and more for sure. That's but there's countervailing things happening. I mean, obviously, society and technology are constantly changing, and there's the example of free and open source software and mass collaboration like Wikipedia. That's sort of a existence proof that awesome things can be created, you know, without you know, under effectively a different legal regime that has been, it's essentially voluntary commons. You're carving out from the default legal regime a commons that allow people to essentially ignore the regime for certain kinds of work. So that's an extremely powerful proof point, and I think that we need more examples like Wikipedia, for example, that not only compete with the you know, existing forms like encyclopedias, but essentially completely destroy the field. I mean that in a form of creative destruction, in that Wikipedia is, it's kind of weird to think about it as an encyclopedia, because no encyclopedia before has, you know, been available in hundreds of languages and been extremely been the best source on many current events and sort of have a huge latent database and everything. So I think that I want to see that kind of category exploding, happening all the time. But I also do think that we need to begin to change the conversation long and redirect it to what's good for society long before we're going to see any changes in, you know, legislation and treaties and things like that. I mean, fundamentally, there's a kind of a collective action problem that's actually very similar to the environment. Nobody has the incentive to bear any costs or renounce any benefit themselves. So of course, everybody, you know, grabs after whatever rights they can gain, even though it's kind of a form of cultural pollution in a way, because when all of culture is restricted by ownership, then you know, you can't even do anything with the, you know, the things that you perceive as you walk around, and that's you know, plays out. It's already playing out very concretely for documentary filmmakers, but I think it's, you know, going to touch more and more going forward. So we need to fundamentally change the conversation and put freedom, equality, and other kinds of social goals before.
Use the equivalent
Right.
Warner Brothers is talking about doing another Batman film. Unless their goal is to make, I don't know, us go, why? They're repeating themselves. How can there be a justification for saying, well, we want to restrict things for creativity's sake when you're not creative? That brings up the question, the way media companies play it safe is also from perspective.
Right.
Well, I'm also really interested in what seems to be coming up as a false commons. So we were talking earlier about Facebook. So this idea too, Facebook is almost so ubiquitous that I feel like it's, almost like a public utility. People use it for so many things, as to let people know what they're doing, to have private discussions, to invite folks to events. And I think it's always really shocking for people to realize too that they've signed they've clicked the I agree button when they open their Facebook account that basically says that they don't own any of the content on there, or that they have turned it over to Facebook. And it's interesting because I think, especially like I have a younger brother who's 22. He doesn't care and he doesn't know any better. But I think that's a really interesting model going forward, that these seemingly public spheres are actually already under a kind of like, corporate ownership, and we're okay with that.
Right. At least implicitly. I mean,
a
lot of people,
it
functions, right, yeah.
And so there's no reason until it doesn't function. And so, like, another thing that came up for me too was Google had ownership of a program called Google Sketchup, which was a free 3D modeling program. And I was using it a lot to do things, and I had an account and I was uploading things and thinking it was Google. It's this sort of like open database that anyone can use. And then about 6 months ago, Google sold it to a private company, and automatically all the content of that public asset turned over to be privately owned unless you opted out. But most people wouldn't opt out because they don't check their accounts that regularly, or they don't know what that means. And I think that was really interesting too, how just without any knowledge at all, something can become privatized, even when you thought you were making something for the public.
Right. I mean, there's so many issues in there, but copyright and patent and trademark are only part of that. There's also ownership of platforms and communication channels and that. And I mean, they all pose really big challenges, at the very least, for everything from freedom of communication to preservation of culture. And I mean, so it's, many awesome things are being created and shared on these private platforms, which, could. And one of the things that people are doing, both kind of as activists in somewhere they don't have permission, is archiving, right? So something called the archive team that primarily rescues stuff that's going to go away, at least puts it in an archive. And then there's people on the more formally legal side trying to curate and keep alive what exists, in the public domain or under free licenses. A lot of this happens on sites associated with Wikipedia, so Wikimedia Commons for sort of multimedia, Wikisource for texts in the public domain. I think there's kind of a saying among cultural preservationists that a dark archive, does a worse job of preserving than a light archive. In other words, an archive that people actually access because you don't know, stuff decays. I think that's true of culture generally, that in the long term will be good for a lively culture, for people to be not just accessing culture, but also, doing interesting stuff with it. And that both kind of copyright and platform lock-in and those sorts of things are all challenges. And again, I would encourage people to think broader than just copyright in dealing with these kind of social information policy issues.
It seems like the world's sort of going through an experiment of determining what the economics of ideas are. So when it was in books, there were certain economics about it. It took the Lewis Hyde sort of amount of economics to sort of produce that. And then at one extreme, when you get into these free sharing sites, the economic goes to pennies instead of dollars. And then even like with the Facebook example that you brought up, I mean, Facebook is also struggling or trying to find what's the economics of the information they have, and it's on the order of about 60 cents a month per person is the value of that information and ideas, and I think that's sort of what's happening. It's trying that exploration of the economics of ideas and is going on.
Yeah.
If I can make an observation of that. In some ways, though, maybe focusing on the economics of dollars and cents to be a distractor from the issue, because then we're focusing on who makes money and who's paying for this, without looking for things that we can't necessarily pay a price for.
I don't know about but the prices comes from I mean, the authors here actually had to do something. The authors had to expend something, to produce the work, and so there's the two sides of the economics. There's the producer side and the consumer side of it.
Yeah, I mean, it's not just it's also the economics of the physical part of information. I mean, Facebook and Google, and I mean, they spend huge amounts of servers to store that information, and that's part of their economics. I think welcome to the future, right? In the sense that the trade-offs between these costs are changing rapidly. The cost of production, the cost of storing information, of sharing information, all of those costs and their relative costs are changing rapidly, which means that there isn't going to be any final business. There isn't something that's a problem with the law deciding to favor a particular business strategy, because those relative costs are changing frequently, and we really need to let the market work it out. But it's a continual working out thing. It's not that we're going to figure out this is what the information of economics is, and this is going to be the business everybody is in over the next 100 years in order to fund the creation of culture and research and keep the servers up and stuff like that. It's going to be constantly changing, and attempt to lock in a particular thing is just going to be detrimental to freedom and equality to begin with, but also to the evolution of culture and technology.
Can I ask you, so if copyright weren't as common, how then would people be compensated? I'm just curious. So because I've been asked that before. So you're against copyright, and I really don't have an answer for that.
Right.
Well, I don't think so. I mean, I don't. So if there were no copyright on anything and everything, was sort of up for grabs, do you think that the incentive would go down for actual production of things? Because another thing that came up, I had a discussion with a writer from the San Francisco Chronicle who had a real issue with this project because,
right.
It has a direct relationship to what he feels is the demise of his industry, which is, the going away of print media and the digitization and sharing of things to kind of cut him out as the writer who was getting compensated for his work. So, I don't know. What do you think?
Well, I mean, there's no question that the incentives. Well, if let's say there, as a thought experiment, there was no copyright, no default restriction on copying of information, that would. Some people create stuff in order to license the exclusive right to make copies. And the incentive to create that sort of material would certainly go down. It would not remotely be the end of culture, because as I was saying before, most stuff is not created in order to monetize in that particular fashion. So it would change culture a little bit, but I think probably less than we expect. In fact, we can look at jurisdictions where there's little actual enforcement of copyright, and you still, for better or worse, have popular culture, as in pop stars and big budget movies. I mean, they're smaller budget than the US because it's a less wealthy economies. But I think most of the cultural phenomena that we're that were kind of seen as the commanding heights of culture now would still basically exist. And I guess another point is that I just want to emphasize putting freedom, equality, and the good of society first in another way, that we will probably like and in fact love whatever culture we end up with. So just because we love, the culture we grew up with and that we talk about every day and share. Before there were big budget Hollywood movies, whatever the popular culture was at the time, people, absolutely loved and were passionate about, and no doubt were very worried that TV or whatever was going to kill. So I'm kind of a skeptic that lack of restriction on information would fundamentally change culture all that much, but I'm also don't think we should be fearful about making changes that will probably benefit society in order to protect certain forms, certain arrangements.